This will be part one of our coverage, chapter 15, variant sexual behavior. Um, what I try to focus on when I talk about the information presented in this chapter is just how difficult it is to separate out cultural values and beliefs, individual values and beliefs from our desire to have some kind of definition of what is and is not normal. Um, in in years past, when I've taught this class, this chapter was sometimes called deviant sexual behavior. It was sometimes called abnormal sexual behavior. The choice of your authors to use the word variant reflects a kind of cultural shift in the landscape of our conversations about these patterns of behavior, with which, especially in a culture like ours, we still continue to be both fascinated with, but simultaneously disturbed by. So I'll try to, it's probably the social psychologist to me. I always try and position our understanding of behaviors in a social and cultural context. So I'll be doing a fair amount of that here, while trying to give you, accurate and up-to-date information about how people who are professional psychologists and psychiatrists think about these categories and try to separate out what is and is not pathological and therefore in need of treatment. So first we need to think about some of the ways in which we conceptualize normal. And that's always a problem word. How do you define normal anyway? And that's something that that psychologists, the clinicians, counselors, psychiatrists, medical doctors all really struggle with. What is and is not normal. And when you're talking about human behavior is it's so complex and it's so multifaceted. Pinning down any particular form of normal is very difficult, and that's especially the case with sexuality. Human beings are remarkably diverse in their sexual expressions, and the things that turn them on are just legion. So we have to really kind of think hard about how we choose to conceptualize normality. Many definitions of what is and isn't normal rely on prevalence, just how common is a particular practice. And then, you can look at that statistic and say what is and is not the most common form of sexual behavior to be engaged in. And if a given sexual practice is very rare, it can be declared abnormal. There's also the criterion of moral correctness, and that has wide definitions in and of itself. You can have religious and values-based definitions of what is and is not appropriate sexual conduct. You can also have legal definitions, where you're violating the rights of other people by engaging in sexual practices of certain kinds. There's also kind of an argument based on quote-unquote naturalness, and that's often proposed by people who see sex as a fundamentally reproductive behavior, and then argue that only sexual practices that are designed for the purpose of procreation are appropriate. Another way of looking at normality is in terms of whether or not particular behaviors are adaptive. And that adaptive standard is one that I'm seeing more frequently in the way sexual dysfunctions and also paraphilias or paraphilic disorders are currently being defined, because they are very much driven by the idea that the behavior causes the person distress, and it causes problems in terms of their ability to adapt in their own lives. So to do the things that they want to do, to have successful relationships, to basically be adaptive human beings. And finally, there's the social construction. All behavior is interpreted. All behavior exists in a social context. And therefore, we we as a culture over time, we have emerging definitions of what is and is not normal sexual behavior. So if you compare my generation with your generation, so most of you are 20 something, early 20s, you've grown up with a different set of socially constructed norms for sexual behavior than the norms that I grew up with. There was barely a conversation about transsexual identity or transgender identity at the time I was growing up. Basically, we had salacious stories in the sports media about certain kinds of characters, and it just wasn't something discussed. So now, in your world, your experience, you have numerous examples of transgender people, and many of those are in your personal experience. So all forms of behavior are socially constructed, and as a result, they can be interpreted and reinterpreted and redefined over time. Remember how I said that the title of this chapter in various textbooks for human sexual behavior has changed over the decades? When I taught this class in the late 90s, the chapter was still called Deviant Sexual Behavior or Abnormal Sexual Behavior. Now it's Variant. That's a values difference, and that's a shift in language. In the DSM-5, and I feel it's really important to kind of think about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in its own historical context. The DSM, for those of you who haven't had an abnormal psychology class, is essentially the diagnostic guidebook that physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors use in order to categorize the experiences of the people that they help. The history of what used to be called sexual deviancy and is now called paraphilic disorders, it's long, it's convoluted, it's complicated, it's filled with stories of prejudice and discrimination, and with pathologizing what would now be seen as perfectly acceptable variations in behavior. I'm going to stick pretty specifically to what we have right now as DSM-5 disorders, which means that these are things that people could see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, a counselor, in order to get help adjusting to or resolving. And the key factor that's been changing in the way the DSM has described paraphilic disorders is the fact that they're called paraphilic disorders. So what happened in developing the DSM-5, the word paraphilia was kind of reworked and replaced by the phrase paraphilic disorder. What they were trying to do here was to really separate out healthy, non-dysfunctional, adaptive expressions of paraphilias versus maladaptive, persistent, intense, distress-causing paraphilic disorders. So they wanted to try and create a way for therapists, for clinicians, for doctors to say, there's a way in which you could have, say, a fetishistic pattern, like having a shoe fetish, but it doesn't interfere with your life, it doesn't cause you distress, it doesn't disrupt your relationships, ergo, it's not a psychological disorder. For people with paraphilic disorders, however, you have persistent, intense arousal that causes distress and impairment of one's social life. So in contrast, you could have someone who has, for example, a fetish where they want to dress in, say, if the person is a heterosexual male, but they get intense sexual satisfaction and arousal when dressed in women's clothing, but having sex with women, if they find that that disturbs them, if it upsets them, if they don't want to engage in the behavior but they feel compelled to do so, and it's causing disruption in their work life, in their relationship, their primary relationships, then it could be described as a paraphilic disorder. So some of the key things here, you have intense atypical sexual arousal patterns accompanied by clinically significant distress or impairment. And again, what the DSM group was trying to do here was to clarify that there are ways in which paraphilias are completely benign in terms of psychological impacts, and instead should be not seen just on the face of them as being as needing clinical attention. In other words, just because you like shoes and get sexual satisfaction from touching them or masturbating while holding them doesn't mean that you have a paraphilic disorder. So to be diagnosed with a paraphilic disorder, the requirement is this: you have to have a person who feels distress about their interest, not just because other people don't like it or think it's weird. People can know that their particular sexual interests, their particular fetish objects are odd, and they may know that other people disapprove, but at the same time, their interest isn't personally distressing, nor does it interfere with their lives. So having a sexual desire that, or a behavior that, and this is the second criteria, involves another person experiencing distress, and typically this is going to be distress that they don't want, so they are not consenting, so they experience distress, injury, or death. That's problematic, so that's seen as disordered. And also, if the person has a desire for sexual behaviors that involve unwilling people or people clearly unable to give their consent, that's considered disordered as well. So you have some key ways in which the DSM-5 group attempted to clarify and allow in some destigmatization of variant sexual behaviors that do in fact deviate from what's normative or prevalent, but at the same time don't necessarily cause anyone else any harm, nor do they cause personal distress. So what are the paraphilic disorders as described in the current DSM-5? The list includes 8 conditions that made it through the process of the updating to the DSM-5. So this is updating from the DSM-4 TR, the text revision of the 4th version. There were a number of disorders proposed, including something called hypersexual disorder, but only these 8 are considered quote-unquote official. So you have exhibitionistic disorder, fetishistic disorder, frauderistic, lovely crossword puzzle word there, frauderistic disorder, pedophilic disorder, sexual masochism disorder, sexual sadism disorder, transvestic disorder, and voyeuristic disorder. We're going to take a look over the course of part 1 and then part 2 at each of these. Now, my approach here, I'm not going to repeat what's included in your text. I'm going to give you some short summaries, and I hope to be able to get the links all put into D12 for you. But I use some posts in a source that, I often tell students don't rely on this, but in the case of informational pieces, the Psychology Today website actually provides some timely, updated pieces written by the staff about particular diagnostic categories, not just the paraphilic disorders, but all diagnostic categories included in the DSM. And they are reviewed by professionals. So most of the information I'll be presenting about these 8 categories of paraphilic disorders has come from those summaries provided on Psychology Today. Before we get into the individual disorders, be aware that the DSM-5 group talked about these disorders as falling into two broad categories. So you have categories that are seen as anomalous activities. So these are behaviors that people would engage in, things that are described as courtship disorders, voyeuristic disorders, exhibitionism, frauderism, and engaging in behaviors either receiving pain or causing pain to others. So those are seen as anomalous activities. The second group of disorders is described as having an anomalous target. So here you have pedophilic disorder, fetishistic disorder, and transvestic. So what they mean by anomalous target is that sexual arousal and interest is directed toward an object that is not considered to be a common or typical, or in some cases, appropriate sexual target. So in the case, for example, of pedophilic disorder, you have adults who have interest and attraction and arousal in response to children who can't consent and who are often quite young. So that's an inappropriate or anomalous target. A different kind of example in fetishistic disorder, you could have virtually any non-sexual object that becomes an object that has taken on the role of being a sexual stimulus for people. So we'll look at each of these in sequence and talk about how they're being defined, and I'll try to give you a little bit of information about what's our current scientific understanding of these categories. And very often what you're going to hear me say is, we don't know what causes these. Keep in mind, human sexual behavior is gloriously diverse. And that means, from a scientific point of view, it's really hard to explain. The fact that we have so much variability and so much complexity to our sexual behaviors as a species means that there's going to be no one reliable explanation of various patterns of behavior. So we'll start with voyeuristic disorder. And a number of you mentioned on perusal how you had noticed that in media portrayals, it's very common to have images of boys, sometimes of men, who are watching unsuspecting people undress and doing so from a clandestine location, sometimes taking pictures, sometimes just watching, and it's played off for humor. I think one of you said something like, boys being boys, they can't help themselves but watch and be fascinated by naked bodies, and how that in a troubling way normalizes such behavior. Do recognize that, voyeurism, while not a serious felony, is a felony in most places. So for people who are diagnosed with voyeuristic disorder, they find it troubling in themselves that they feel compelled to watch other people in secret, and they find it sexually arousing to do so. So the diagnostic criteria, and you're going to get familiar with the real standard language here, over a period of at least 6 months, recurrent intense sexual arousal from observing unsuspecting people who are naked, undressing, or engaged in sexual activity. These are individuals who report being persistently bothered by fantasies involving voyeurism, by feeling compelled to set up situations where they can watch, and feeling guilty and unhappy, troubled by the behaviors that they're expressing. In addition, the person has to have actually acted on these urges with a non-consenting person. So you can't just sit in your room and say, what would it be like if I watched someone do X, Y, or Z? Instead, these are people who have actually engaged in this pattern of behavior for a significant period of time, and it troubles them a great deal. It may have gotten them in trouble. Most people who end up in treatment for voyeuristic disorder do have their entry into therapy through the criminal justice system. So it's interfered with their lives. They've gotten arrested, they've been fined, they've been required to seek treatment or something like that. So there's significant distress, there's impairment in social occupational functioning. You can think about the person who gets caught having spied on girls in the dressing room at a high school, or another case that I remember was of a hotel proprietor who created a network of peeping holes that looked like false ventilation so that he could spy on the guests in his hotel. Those are individuals who got arrested, were charged with crimes, and then entered into therapy in order to try and resolve their problems. Sometimes they're court-ordered into therapy. Now, that doesn't mean every single person with voyeuristic disorder is going to enter into therapy through the route of the criminal justice system. It's just more typical that they would. Individuals have to be at least 18 years of age, and that kind of distinction of 18 years of age or older means that it's not that there aren't people who are voyeuristic who are below the age of 18. Those behaviors are usually classified as an impulse control disorder if they are exhibited in children below the age of 18. We don't know research-wise of any specific cause for voyeuristic disorder. There do appear to be certain risk factors that are associated in the literature, but you should understand that the vast majority of the data on this comes from a forensic population, meaning people who have been arrested and then adjudicated for voyeuristic behaviors. Among that population, the risk factors include abusing substances, having experienced sexual abuse in the past, and the experience of some degree of hypersexualization. But beyond those kinds of risk factors, those are correlated factors that have been found in investigations of forensic populations. We don't have good explanations for telling us what kind of person is likely to develop this pattern of behavior. Now, exhibitionistic disorder, and I include the picture because this is the stereotype that often shows up for us in our mind's eye when we think about exhibitionism. The trench coat clad creeper who flashes unsuspecting people on the street. Exhibitionism is actually far more broad than that. And in our current social media and smartphone and computer internet landscape, exhibitionism takes many more diverse forms than it has in the past. Again, the descriptors here are going to sound really familiar. Each of the pedophilic disorders is going to follow the same kind of framework. Over a period of at least 6 months, the person has recurrent, intense, arousing fantasies, behaviors, urges that involve exposing the genitals to unsuspecting people. So you have the same thing, 6 months, and then the clause, recurrent, intense, arousing fantasies, behaviors, urges. So there's the quality of compulsiveness here, obsessiveness, and the idea that just like with voyeuristic disorder, you have an unsuspecting person. But in this case, voyeurs watch. The other person may or may not ever know. In exhibitionism, part of the arousal is the shock, the horror, the disgust, the discomfort, even the fear inspired in the other person. Just like with voyeuristic disorder, the person has to act on these sexual urges with a non-consenting person and experience marked distress, problems at work, problems at home, problems in everyday social situations. There are a variety of subtypes In some cases, you have very specific kinds of targets, like exhibitionists who target specifically adult women, or you can have exhibitionists who target children. Sometimes both. Sometimes their exhibitionism is live and in person. Sometimes it's purely electronic. Some of you mentioned on perusal the idea of sending pictures of one's genitals to people electronically that they didn't ask for. So non-consensual, quote unquote, dick pics, for example. That's a newer form of exhibitionistic behavior that can become quite compulsive in some cases. As with as I described with voyeuristic disorder, the risk factors are typically that research comes from a forensic population. So it comes from people who've been arrested, who've been charged with violations of law, such as using your cell phone to send naked pictures to people who don't want them, particularly if they're minors. So this research typically has been drawing on a forensic population. So the risk factors that have been derived from that population is males are far more likely to be exhibitionistic in this particular way than females. Although you could argue on that point. I mean, there are whole professions that encourage women to undress for men. But the difference is that the audience is willingly participating in that. Exhibitionism, by its definition, requires that the person be unwilling and be unsuspecting. So risk factors, being male, having antisocial personality disorder, abusing alcohol and possibly other drugs, and especially if you're looking at exhibitionism generally, there is an association with pedophilia. So for example, people who have been arrested for pedophilia and convicted often have a history of exhibitionism, particularly with child victims. Although the research is challenging there because you're dealing with, data that comes from individuals who have been caught, arrested, and adjudicated. What you don't know about is the people who haven't. So there are some gaping holes in our knowledge there. Some other factors that have been found to be predictive in some research, individuals who engage in exhibitionism do have a tendency, and it's a correlation, they have a tendency to have experienced emotional abuse during childhood, or to have shown a preoccupation with sexual things beyond their age as children. Again, those are correlational findings. It's not, a causal thing. Every kid that has experienced abuse, and particularly sexual abuse, will not become an exhibitionist. So it's not a one-to-one causal relationship. It's a correlated risk factor. Frauderistic disorder, and I have this vague memory the first time I read the word frauderistic. It was in a sexual behavior seminar that I was taking that I was sitting in on in graduate school. So it may be a word unfamiliar to you, but probably not an experience, especially if you're female, not an experience that is in fact unfamiliar, just the label. Frauderistic disorder involves touching unsuspecting people who have not consented to be touched. So touching their genitals, touching their breasts, touching their backsides, rubbing them, especially with your pelvic area or with an erect penis. I know from personal experience, frankly, I don't know a lot of women who haven't had someone do this to them at some point in time, which is a real sad commentary. I know many women who have described stories of being on public transportation, or being on a dance floor, or being at a bar, or some other public place where they were in line, and someone just touches them without, in a sexually inappropriate way, without their permission. And it is a very, disturbing kind of experience. So with frauderistic disorder, the person experiences, and again, it's the same kind of language, intense fantasies, urges, and keen sexual arousal focused on touching unsuspecting, non-consenting people. Generally, these are groping incidents that happen from behind or the side, but that's not necessarily required. The behavior has a compulsive quality. It's repetitive. Typical reports of frauderism are in crowded places, as I described, buses, trains, elevators, even on the street. Like I said, some of my friends and acquaintances have told stories of, groping on the dance floor, groping in bars, and sometimes you're kind of caught off guard by it, and you think, oh, that's just bar behavior of drunk people. But it's the same kind of pattern of abusive behavior that happens to lots of people in lots of other contexts as well. It's defined as a mental health disorder when the behavior persists longer than 6 months and when they cause distress or dysfunction. So sometimes people ask me, well, how is this different from run-of-the-mill sexually assaultive sexual harassment behaviors committed by people, say, in the workplace or in their everyday lives? We hear a lot about that in this kind of Me Too environment. Well, the difference is the clause that says significant distress or dysfunction in the person's relationships and activities. And it's the distress component that's the most critical. So people who engage in sort of repetitive frauderistic behavior, they will put themselves in situations where they're in crowds, where they have access to potential targets, and they will, touch them. And part of the arousal of it is the fact that the person doesn't want it. So to contrast that with someone who is a serial sexual harasser, who touches people inappropriately, say in the workplace, that person isn't distressed by what they're doing. They may experience arousal to it. They may experience some excitement and intense interest, but they're not distressed by it. It may interfere with their lives. It may get them fired. It may get them arrested. It may get them sued. So that's where kind of the line gets fuzzy. For example, you could have cases where an individual in the workplace has been called out for frauderistic behavior, for touching people inappropriately in the workplace, and their HR department will say you're fired unless you get therapy. They may be diagnosed with frauderistic disorder in that case, and then work toward alleviating the problem. If you look specifically at the diagnostic criteria, however, personal distress is a key component. As with the other disorders I've discussed so far, we don't know a cause. There's no one particular cause in forensic populations. That's what we know the most about. The risk factors might include a long-term preoccupation with sex and a tendency to be hypersexual. So by hypersexual, meaning the person has a higher sex drive, a higher interest in sex, a higher engagement, level of engagement in sexual activities. So many of these individuals report having intrusive thoughts that are very frequent, and intrusive, intense sexual urges that they have difficulty controlling. And again, these feelings, these urges, feel compulsive, and they're distressing to the person. Now, the next two categories are are probably ones that, for your generation, you've gotten this weird exposure to the BDSM world through the 50 Shades phenomenon. I can't really turn on my subscription to Hulu Live, which is now my substitute for cable, and not find the sanitized versions of the movies on some station somewhere. So we're in this weird historical time where there's been a popularization of bondage and sadomasochism and the whole BDSM world, but really through a very skewed lens. So as we talk about these two categories, sexual masochism disorder and sexual sadism disorder, we have to be very careful to separate out the difference between the pathological definition of, say, sexual masochism disorder as described by the DSM, and people who consciously, ethically, and in healthy ways choose to engage in masochism, in sadism, in bondage, and so on. So I'll try to be very careful to help you wrap your head around at least a little bit the differences here. And a lot of it has to do with that very overly repeated word now, distress. And another part of it has to do with the degree to which partners are themselves consenting. So a sexual masochism disorder, again, similar language to our other disorders here, recurrent, intense sexual arousal from being beaten, humiliated, bound, or having some other form of suffering inflicted upon you, such as dripping hot wax, flames, cutting, in sometimes fairly horrific forms. Sometimes this involves, being leashed, being collared, being asked to behave like a non-human animal. You name it, you can imagine it. Whatever form of masochistic humiliation is possible here. So the person would experience fantasies, urges, a desire, and that has to be present for at least 6 months. As with every other disorder we've discussed in this chapter, it has to cause clinically significant problems for the person. So what you're thinking about here is a person who becomes intensely sexually aroused when they are being hurt, when they are experiencing pain, when they are restricted, restrained, bound, when they're being struck, when they're being cut, when they're being burned, for example. And the level of intensity and the degree to which people suffer injuries varies. But the person feels upset by it. They don't want to feel this way. They feel compelled and obsessed with the thoughts of being engaged in these kinds of behaviors. We don't have good theoretical models that actually explain in a way that is evidence-based why masochism might occur. There are lots of psychoanalytic explanations about, flawed upbringing. Some have argued that the roots of masochism, the sexual masochism disorder, are in having been abused sexually and otherwise as a child, or having been sexually assaulted. But as logical as that might sound in your head, we don't have empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case. One suggestion is that the fascination might come from the idea that such behaviors are forbidden. Masochistic imagery is very common in media, and the idea of it is often conflated with romance, as we've seen in recent media phenomenon like the 50 Shades debacle. But 50 Shades didn't start it. It's been around for a very long time, especially if people have been exposed when they're young to fairly steady doses of highly available pornography. Masochism themes, particularly featuring women in the masochist role, are very, very common. And one theory suggests that if people experience intense sexual arousal when watching those kinds of images, it may become more than merely interesting to them. It may become an obsession of a sort. Other theories suggest that people find these experiences incredibly intense. They are. Physical pain has a tendency to generate at the brain level neurochemicals that are not unrelated to opiates. So there's theories that there's both psychological escape, because these patterns of behavior often involve role playing, but there's also the neurobiological possibility that you can find the experience of pain and then coupling it with sexual arousal intensely satisfying. Now, the key is, because there are people who engage in BDSM activities who are willing, they are intelligently choosing these behaviors, and they have a high degree of control over their involvement. They find intense sexual arousal and satisfaction that's coupled with the experience of being bound and having pain inflicted on them. But they're not distressed by it. They have incorporated this into their life, and they engage in it as a chosen pattern of behavior. While that may not be something you would ever consider normal, it is in fact something that people engage in fairly significant numbers. Where does it cross the line for psychologists to disorder? The key issue, again, like the other disorders we've looked at, is the persistent, intense, unbidden, distressing nature of the fantasies and behaviors. Now we'll finish today, we'll finish this part of the coverage of the chapter with a discussion of sexual sadism disorder. Again, your generation has the weird distinction of you came of age during the era of 50 Shades of Grey, which really has introduced, and not in an accurate way, the BDSM world to the mainstream. Sexual sadism disorder, and like with sexual masochism disorder, you have to clearly distinguish between the informed, careful engagement in BDSM activities among consenting adults who have an ethical way of going about it, meaning they have consensual agreements, they have discussions, they have rules about how they go about their behaviors. In the case of sexual sadism disorder, just like with the other disorders we've looked at so far, persistent, intense sexual arousal from causing or fantasizing about causing the suffering of other people, with or without their consent. So in many cases, sexual sadism disorder comes to the attention of clinicians through a forensic route, but not always. In some cases, a person may be particularly troubled by the fact that when they are sexually aroused, they fantasize about strangling someone or cutting them or hitting them or debasing them in some way. Or when they want to get sexually aroused, they find that thinking about such things or engaging in those behaviors turns them on. The key issue, as with our other disorders, this pattern of persistent, intense arousal has to have been present for the person for 6 months and to have caused severe distress or dysfunction. As I said, in some cases, people will come into therapy because they've been ordered to do so, because they've hurt someone who didn't agree to be hurt in the way that they were hurt, or they've been asking their partner and in fact hurt them. So they may come to therapy through that route. In other cases, it's not through the court system, but because the relationship's blown up. Perhaps they've sought out situations where they can engage in sadistic behaviors with a partner, and it's outside of their primary relationships. So there's disruption to one's life, whether it's in the justice system or in their personal lives. But at the same time, it causes them distress. So you have to kind of, in your mind, think, what's the difference between a dominant who engages in role play and sexual activities in which they control, debase, beat, tie up, and otherwise humiliate a sexual partner who's mutually agreed and consented to engage in all of those activities? What's the difference between that and a person who is plagued by fantasies of wanting to engage in those behaviors, but doesn't want to feel that way? They want instead, sexual relationships and arousal in nonviolent ways. So the distinction is really about that critical word, distress. The research here, again, it's murky. It's difficult to study people who engage in behaviors that are seen by the broader culture as problematic. And certainly if you're talking about people who engage in sexually sadistic patterns, whether you consider them to be disordered or not, it's often a sheltered or hidden pattern of behavior. At least until relatively recently, that's not something we discussed in everyday life. But what research we have, some of it comes from clinical populations, some of it comes from forensic populations. There is an association between antisocial patterns, so characteristics of antisocial personality disorder have been found to be associated with the desire to engage in sexually sadistic patterns of behavior. So for example, losses of impulse control, being manipulative, being dishonest, diminished arousal states generally, so slow to arouse, and lack of empathy and remorse have been found to be associated with interest in sexual sadism. Some researchers have argued, and this comes from clinical research, that individuals with sexually sadistic patterns, fantasies, arousal patterns, behaviors, they can be quite dangerous individuals. So it's often difficult in the clinical literature to kind of think through when most of the people you have available to you to study have been convicted of crimes or they are suspected of crimes, such as assault or sexual assault or rape or even murder. It becomes hard to distinguish that population from other people who engage in ethically appropriate sexually sadistic behavior. And by ethically appropriate, what I mean is within the context of a mature BDSM relationship or engagement, because sometimes you have kind of contractually developed connections, like BDSM clubs, for example, where people come in, they have very specific criteria, they have very specific roles to play, and there are rules. When BDSM is done appropriately, you have adults who understand their sexuality very well, they understand their needs, they understand their interests, and they understand their roles. They agree on what behaviors are going to be appropriate, and they have agreed upon ways of stopping play, such that things won't go too far. Now, does that mean it never goes too far? No, but that's the case in any kind of sexual behavior, not just BDSM. In thinking about causes of sexually sadistic behavior, we have no shortage of theories, but we don't have a lot of good data to help us understand exactly how someone would become sexually sadistic, particularly if they are behaving in response to their intense fantasies, their intense arousal with partners who are not consenting. Some have theorized that there's an escapist quality to enacting sexually sadistic behavior. In some cases, this involves role-playing games, but not always. So there may be that kind of involvement. Some have theorized that wide-scale exposure to or compulsive exposure to pornography that includes S&M themes and images can increase the likelihood, but we don't have good data to support that as an actual cause. More psychoanalytic theories have talked about releasing hidden or forbidden sexual fantasies. So we don't have really good information about what causes these things to happen. And you might have noticed, as I'm walking through these disorders, I'm very carefully trying to help you to make the distinction between people who are in a non-distressing way, in a way that doesn't cause them adaptive problems, engaging in behaviors that are atypical but not destructive, and drawing the distinction between that and behaviors that are troubling to the person, troubling to others, and very maladaptive. And that's really what the people developing the DSM were attempting to do. Now we'll pick things up next time by talking about pedophilic disorder, which for many, many reasons is a very difficult construct to discuss. So that's where we'll pick up next time.